History has no shortage of brilliant minds whose work pushed against the boundaries of science, only for their lives to end under circumstances that remain clouded, contested, and in some cases, suspicious. These minds included Stanley Meyer, the prodigal son who promised a car that could run on nothing but water. There was also Royal Rife, who swore he had discovered a way to destroy disease with light and frequency, forcing the public to ask, did he actually find a cure for cancer, or was it a science sham? And finally, there was Eugene Mallove, the scientist-turned-whistleblower whose case of infinite energy claimed cold fusion was real, and that its proof was being buried. Each of them drew admiration and ridicule in equal measure, but all three carried the weight of ideas that threatened entrenched systems of money and power. And in the end, all three are remembered as much for the mystery of their deaths as for the boldness of their discoveries. For the Evidence Room, this is the story of Meyer, Rife, and Mallove, whose ideas inspired greatness, but whose deaths inspired suspicion. Stanley Allen Meyer was born in Ohio on August 24, 1940, and from an early age, he seemed to stand apart. He grew up on Columbus's east side before his family relocated to Grandview Heights, and though his schooling was unremarkable, he graduated high school and briefly attended Ohio State. Meanwhile, his mind was restless, always turning towards invention. After serving in the military, he entered the working world with a confidence that matched his towering 6'3" frame and his booming voice. Those who knew him often remarked on how easily he could shift registers, speaking in technical jargon with scientists one moment, then simplifying his ideas for blue-collar workers the next. His charisma and persuasive streak were undeniable, but so too was his eccentric nature. He peppered his speech with the unusual phrase, quote, "Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition," end quote, a reflection of his habit of infusing even scientific discussions with religious fervor. At times, his paranoia bled through, but so did his generosity. Meyer was a man who gave freely to causes he believed in, even while cultivating a sense that forces were always working against him. Meyer's professional resume was as varied as it was ambitious. He worked at the Battelle Foundation in Ohio, contributed to NASA's Gemini space program, and even took part in research for a concept eBed, a proposed piece of Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as the Star Wars Defense Project. Alongside his twin brother Stephen, he also ran a multi-million-dollar business in transport and spare parts. But his true passion lay in invention. Over the course of his life, Meyer authored more than 40 patents across a range of fields: oceanography, cardiac monitoring, banking validation systems, and, most notably, energy. In 1993, his achievements earned him recognition as Inventor of the Year. He boasted of backing from governments in Canada, England, and Sweden, and his patents often flew through the approval process in record time, sometimes in as little as 8 months. Depending on who you asked, Meyer was either a visionary on the cusp of changing the world or a slick-talking fraud. But the invention that would cement his reputation was the so-called water fuel cell. Meyer claimed it could split water into hydrogen and oxygen through an electrical resonance process that required far less energy than traditional electrolysis. If true, it was revolutionary. The hydrogen could be used to power a combustion engine, producing only water vapor as exhaust. These implications were staggering: near free fuel, zero harmful emissions, and the potential to break the stranglehold of the oil industry. Meyer leaned into the spectacle of his claims too. He famously unveiled a dune buggy retrofitted to run on water alone, boldly stating it could travel across the United States on just 22 gallons. Spark plugs were replaced with hydrogen-oxygen injectors, and he insisted his car could achieve 180 kilometers on only 4 liters of water. He cast his technology not just as a scientific breakthrough, but as a divine mission. To him, it was a way of protecting God's creation from mankind's destruction. His demonstrations drew attention far beyond Ohio. Esteemed observers, including professors of Queen Mary University, admirals of the British Navy, and chemists of American notoriety, all attended live showings of Meyer's vehicle. Some left convinced they had seen something extraordinary, claiming the system appeared to produce more hydrogen and oxygen than conventional science would allow. And yet, none of them could offer verifiable proof. You see, for every believer who hailed Meyer as the man who might free humanity from fossil fuels, there were just as many skeptics. Experts like Philip Ball of Nature dismissed his invention outright as pseudoscience, pointing out that it flagrantly violated the laws of thermodynamics. Courts would later echo that conclusion, ruling his water fuel cell to be nothing more than a dressed-up version of conventional electrolysis. Even his terminology invited confusion. Meyer called his device a fuel cell, though it consumed electricity rather than generating it. Still, his story refused to fade. Meyer became a recurring figure in alternative energy circles, embraced as a maverick inventor who had either cracked the code or stumbled into the kind of breakthrough that powerful industries would never allow to see the light of day. His supporters saw a visionary silenced by skeptics, while his detractors saw only smoke and mirrors. But no matter what side one fell on, Meyer had accomplished something few inventors ever do. He had planted himself firmly as a man whose promises seemed at once outlandish, but just possible enough to inspire hope. By the mid-1990s, Stanley Meyer's invention had reached well beyond Ohio. Local outlets followed his claims closely, but the story also spilled into international headlines when producers featured him in the 1995 BBC documentary, It Runs on Water. Either way, his name had become fixed in the alternative energy underground, where conspiracy theories flourished. And with that attention brought trouble. Meyer attracted serious investment from believers eager to ride the wave of his so-called water fuel cell. Among them was William Brooks, an Alaskan who poured $300,000 into Meyer's work, only to have a Franklin County, Ohio court return the money in 1994 after a legal dispute. And just 2 years later, Stanley Meyer's empire unraveled further. In 1996, a pair of investors took him to court in Fayette County. Independent experts were allowed to probe his system directly, and what they found was devastating. Nothing new, only standard electrolysis. The judge ruled Meyer had committed, quote, gross and egregious fraud, ordering him to repay $25,000. The ruling struck at both his finances and his reputation, and though he pressed on, the cracks in his empire were widening. Then, on March 20th, 1998, it all came crashing down with his sudden and bizarre death. Meyer was having dinner at a Cracker Barrel restaurant in Grove City, Ohio, with his twin brother Stephen and 2 Belgian investors. After taking a sip of cranberry juice, he lurched up from the table. Clutching his neck, he staggered outside, collapsed, vomited, and gasped his 3 final words, quote, "They poisoned me." Minutes later, Stanley Meyer was dead in the parking lot. Police launched an investigation under Detective Steve Robinette, but toxicology found no evidence of poison. The coroner declared it a cerebral aneurysm, the result of long-standing hypertension. The case was then quickly closed as natural causes within 3 months. To many, that explanation never sat right. Meyer's dramatic final words and the timing of his death fed the belief that he had been assassinated, taken out by oil interests, foreign agents, or even the very investors sitting with him at the table. His brother Stephen later claimed they had been offered bribes to walk away from the technology and that Stanley had received threats. No evidence has ever substantiated these theories, and yet suspicion lingered. One of the Belgian financiers who had been present that night denied any wrongdoing and said he considered Meyer a friend. Stephen, however, recalled the men's eerie silence after being told of Stanley's death. They offered no condolences, they asked no questions. Something Stephen said haunted him for years thereafter. However, no matter how many nightmares he had or how much doubt creeped into his soul, there wasn't much Stephen could do. But the story did not end on that fateful night at Cracker Barrel. Within a week of his death, Stanley Meyer's famed dune buggy and his instruments were stolen from his garage. They were later recovered, though under murky circumstances, and rumors swirled for years about who had possession of the vehicle. Reports placed it in Canada as late as 2014, allegedly in the hands of a family once connected to Meyer. Today, its exact whereabouts remain unknown. Meyer's patents have since expired and entered the public domain, and while some work to keep his memory alive, like James Roby, founder of the Kentucky Water Fuel Museum, his brother Stephen declined to carry on the fight. After watching Stanley's paranoia, legal battles, and sudden death, he said he wanted no part of what had consumed his twin. Stanley Meyer remains an ambiguous figure, part visionary, part showman, part cautionary tale. His inventions may never have lived up to their extraordinary promise, but his death and the mystery that followed ensured that, in conspiracy circles and alternative science communities, his name would never be forgotten. He'd be remembered alongside other names like Royal Rife and Eugene Mallove, whose questionable fates deserve their own deeper dives into the abyss. Royal Raymond Rife was born in 1888 and came of age in an era of rapid scientific progress. A gifted engineer and inventor, he devoted his career to optical microscopy, building machines that many contemporaries described as marvels of precision. By the late 1920s and 30s, he was constructing instruments unlike anything else in the world. Microscopes, he claimed, could magnify specimens up to 17,000 times. Rife used polarized monochromatic light to produce brilliant false color effects that, according to him, allowed bacteria and viruses to glow in distinctive hues. Typhoid shined turquoise, leprosy a ruby red. He said his methods revealed fragile organisms without staining, preserving their natural forms for study. It was under these lenses, Rife claimed, that he saw things others had missed. He insisted that microbes could alter their form, shifting into smaller versions of themselves depending on their environment. Most controversially, he maintained that cancer itself was tied to a pleomorphic microbe, a microbe that could take up to 5 distinct forms, from something like common E. coli to something closer to a fungus. It should be said that none of these observations were ever confirmed by mainstream microbiology, but Royal Rife presented them as the foundation for his life's most provocative invention. In the early 1930s, he unveiled what he called the beam ray device, a machine said to emit carefully tuned radio frequencies that could, quote, devitalize microorganisms without damaging human tissue. Each germ, he believed, had a unique mortal oscillatory rate, a frequency at which it could be shattered like glass under a violin's pitch. Newspapers in the 1930s treated his work with cautious curiosity. Rife himself avoided calling it a cure for cancer, instead describing it as a means of disabling disease organisms in the body. Still, the implications were clear. If his claims were true, he had created a machine that could neutralize disease without surgery or drugs. For a time, Rife's reputation seemed secure. He demonstrated his microscopes to respected physicians, and in 1944, the Smithsonian Institution included a description of one of his devices in its annual report. Some doctors praised the clarity of his optics, but when it came to his sweeping claims about microbes and frequency therapy, mainstream science drew a line. The American Medical Association, the American Cancer Society, and other medical authorities dismissed his findings as unsubstantiated, even dangerous. What Rife saw as discovery, the establishment branded pseudoscience. All those years of rejection hardened him. In his later years, Rife accused the AMA of conspiring to suppress his work, convinced he had been targeted not because he was wrong, but because he threatened entrenched interests. By the time of his death in California in 1971, he had long since fallen into obscurity. He died penniless, embittered, and convinced that his discoveries had been buried by powerful forces. And to this day, his name lingers at the fringes of science, as both a cautionary tale of unverified claims and, for some, a martyr of medical conspiracy. Eugene Franklin Mallove was born in Norwich, Connecticut in 1947, the son of Gladys and Mitchell Mallove. From the start, he was a child drawn to the mysteries of the universe. Astronomy captivated him, and that sense of wonder never left. He carried it into his education, first through Norwich Free Academy, and then into the halls of MIT, where he earned both bachelor's and master's degrees in aeronautical and astronautical engineering by 1970. He would go on to Harvard for his doctorate in environmental health sciences. And alongside those achievements, he began a family, marrying Joanne Smith in 1970, and later raising two children, Kimberlyn and Ethan. His professional career reflected the same restless curiosity. Mallove worked at Hughes Research Laboratories, the Analytic Science Corporation, and MIT's Lincoln Laboratory, carving out a niche in aerospace and propulsion research. He co-authored studies on bold interstellar concepts, solar sails capable of reaching Alpha Centauri, laser-driven propulsion, and even an idea once dreamed up to harvest hydrogen atoms in deep space. He was fascinated with how far humanity could go if only its energy needs could be answered. But Mallove was not simply a researcher in a lab. By the 1980s, he was serving as the chief science writer at MIT, tasked with translating the breakthroughs of a prestigious institution for the wider public. That post would prove pivotal, because it was here that Mallove collided with the subject that would define his legacy and his estrangement from the scientific mainstream. In 1989, when Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons stunned the world with their announcement of cold fusion, claiming they had created nuclear fusion at room temperature, Mallove became one of its most vocal defenders. He believed the pair, and he believed in their data. While most of the scientific establishment dismissed the claim as either error or fraud, Mallove insisted that the evidence was not only real, but actively being buried. By 1991, he had resigned from MIT in protest, accusing the institution of suppressing favorable cold fusion results in order to protect the billions of dollars already invested in conventional fusion research. He turned his disillusionment into advocacy, authoring books that argued that scientists before him had indeed tapped into something profound, only to be drowned out by ridicule and resistance. This followed his earlier works that spoke to his lifelong pursuit of energy and exploration beyond Earth. For Eugene Mallove, science was not just an academic exercise, but his life's calling. And when mainstream doors closed, he walked into the world of fringe science and alternative energy with a renewed zeal. He became one of cold fusion's most eloquent champions, convinced that a revolution in energy was not only possible, but already proven, and worst of all, being deliberately ignored. That conviction would eventually bring him both a following and, some argue, powerful enemies. On May 14, 2004, Eugene Mallove's life ended in the driveway of his childhood home in Norwich, Connecticut. He had gone there to clean out the property, which his parents still owned, but sometime that day he was ambushed. Neighbors only remembered him mowing the lawn that morning. By evening, he was found sprawled in his own blood, his body bearing the marks of a savage beating. 32 separate lacerations, a crushed trachea, and clear evidence of stomping. His shoes and wallet were missing, his van abandoned later at a casino. For a man already dogged by controversy for his outspoken defense of cold fusion, the circumstances of his death seemed almost scripted for conspiracy. The brutality of the crime scene ignited speculation instantly. Mallove had built his reputation as both a visionary and a whistleblower, and his claims of energy suppression had made him enemies. Supporters quickly pointed to shadowy forces with a motive to silence him. Police, however, took a more pragmatic view. They leaned toward a robbery gone wrong, or a dispute over property, especially given that tenants had only recently been evicted from the house. Theories of assassination swirled in newspapers and energy forums, but the early investigation uncovered no trace of exotic foul play. Instead, detectives pieced together a more mundane, but no less harrowing story. The case dragged on for years. By 2008, with little progress, a new task force offered a $50,000 reward. It was only then that the cracks appeared. An informant came forward, recalling how Candace Foster, the girlfriend of one of the suspects, had confessed in a moment of weakness that her partner returned home the night of the murder with bloody clothes. Schaefer's cousin, Moselle Brown, had been with him. Witnesses remembered Schaefer growing visibly anxious whenever Mallove's death appeared in the news. Eventually, Foster herself admitted the truth. According to her testimony, the killing began as a confrontation. Eugene Mallove had evicted Schaefer's parents 2 weeks earlier, after a drawn-out process, and when personal belongings were tossed from the home, resentment boiled over. That night, Schaefer and Brown attacked him in the backyard, beating him until he collapsed. They left him gasping for air, still alive. Hours later, they returned with Foster, only to find him clinging to life. Brown ended it with one final stomp to the throat. To mask the crime, they staged it as a robbery, stripping his wallet and shoes, while Foster drove the van to a casino to abandon it. Justice came, but unevenly. Brown, deemed the most violent participant, was sentenced to more than 50 years. Schaefer received 25, with parole possible after 17. Foster, who cooperated with investigators, received a much lighter sentence. Time in prison followed by probation. For Mallove's family, the sentences offered closure, but not consolation. His killing was eventually recorded as an act of personal vengeance, born of eviction and humiliation. But in the years since, the conspiracy theories have not faded. many still point to the timing, the savagery, and Mallove's own history of claims that powerful interests had tried to bury. The reality may be that both stories, of a bitter property dispute and of a man who believed himself silenced, sit side by side. His murder was not the surgical strike of oil barons or federal agents, but it removed a voice that had refused to quit, and for his supporters, that coincidence will never sit comfortably. Whether the forces that silenced them were simply time, chance, and the violence of ordinary men, or something far more deliberate, remains a question without an answer. What is certain is that the stories of Stanley Meyer, Royal Rife, and Eugene Mallove continue to echo in conspiracy forums, in alternative energy circles, and in the archives of unsolved mysteries. Each case demonstrates the fragile line between genius and delusion, promise and paranoia, invention and exploitation. But they also leave behind a deeper unease, that when knowledge collides with power, it is often not the ideas that are buried first, it is the people who carry them.